Hello and welcome once again to Climate Talks. During this month of October, it is customary to commemorate the 13th as International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction, a day that encourages every citizen and government to take part in building more disaster resilient communities and nations. So, this episode will concentrate on a particular element of climate change that is directly related to the likelihood of increased disasters: the rise of sea levels. Our main presentation comes from Dr. Benjamin Strauss, who is Chief Executive Officer at Climate Central in the USA. We are privileged to be offering some data and findings presented by Dr. Strauss that have not been made public until now. As a reaction to these revelations, we have two guests, Mr. Kamal Kishore and Mr. Marco Toscano-Rivalta. Mr. Kamal is member of the Indian's National Disaster Management Authority, or NDMA, and co-chair of the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, or GFDRR. Mr. Kishore has worked on disaster risk reduction and recovery issues for over 22 years at the local, national, regional, and global levels. Mr. Toscano-Rivalta is chief of the UNGRR Regional Office for Asia Pacific and has over 20 years' experience with the United Nations and other international organizations. But first, the Climate Central report. They are an independent organization of leading scientists and journalists researching and reporting the facts about our changing climate and its impact on the public. Dr. Strauss is not only the CEO, but is also their chief scientist.
The presentation today is about some very fresh maps, some very fresh imagery that illustrate the risk to Asia from sea level rise and coastal flooding. I've got to start with something that may seem pretty basic, which is the idea of understanding how high the ground is that we stand on. You'd kind of think we know that, but in fact, the data for much of Asia and much of the rest of the world are quite poor. While the scientific community focused on disasters and climate change, sea level rise, we've focused 99.9% of our energy on how far and how quickly the sea level will rise, or how high storms could raise waters when they come in. And those are extremely important things. But while we've looked at the moving ball, it turns out we really don't know a lot about the elevation of the land in many parts of the world. Now, the image I'm showing you in blue shows land less than 2 meters above sea level, actually in part of the United States, in blue, right? It would flood if the water was that high. And this is based on very high quality elevation data, based on something called airborne LiDAR. But for most of Asia, the academic community, the World Bank, most researchers don't have access. The LiDAR data doesn't exist, or there's no access to it. And so instead use satellite-based elevation data. And unfortunately, measuring from a satellite produces much less accurate data. And here's a picture of what the satellite data would say the vulnerability is in this same area compared to our kind of higher quality ground truth. It shows a much lesser threat. And there's a reason for that. When you're sending signals down from a satellite to measure elevation on land, by the time the beam reaches the surface, it's pretty broad. And when it comes down, it's going to hit things like rooftops and treetops. And the satellite signal generally can't tell the difference between a rooftop and a treetop, at least the legacy signals that were used in the development of all of the major global elevation data sets used by the research community today. Except for a new data set, which a colleague and I developed using machine learning to take those satellite data sets, but improve them to try and eliminate that effect of rooftops and treetops, which when they're blended in with ground elevation, makes land look higher than it is, which is a real problem when you're trying to understand flood risk and sea level rise risk. Just this September, we published the second version of Coastal Dam, which, while the first edition was a big leap, a quantum leap over the satellite data that came before, the second version of Coastal Dam is a huge leap over the one that we originally released. And here's a quick picture of what I mean when I talk about performance. Um, the bars show the error of elevation data compared to the best we have for ground truth, this satellite-based LiDAR laser measurements. And the research community has principally used the data set here called MERIT, and its predecessor, which doesn't perform as well, called SRTM. Um, uh, MERIT comes from scientific researchers. AW3D30 is developed by the Japanese government, Tandem-X by the German Aerospace Agency, and NASA-DEM is NASA in the United States, their latest generation. You can see that on average, all of these elevation data sets think that the land is 1.5 meters higher than it really is, or more. And when we're projecting only, less than a meter of sea level rise by the end of this century, that's a big problem. You can look at our coastal dam, and you can see that both versions very much reduce this error, but the first one we released did underestimate elevation by almost 0.5 meter in a global average, whereas the newest version really gets essentially to zero. Here's a quick look on a country by country basis for countries where we had enough data to compare ground truth to the performance of elevation data. Here is that widely used MERIT data set. You can see that it is overestimating elevations across Asia in the 1 to 2 meter range. So projecting a sense of security, unfortunately, which isn't there. And now compare that to the data we've just released, and I'm about to show you a whole bunch of maps using these data. We're still overestimating elevation and therefore underestimating risk in China. So there are an enormous amount of stories waiting to be found, waiting to be told from these maps. And I hope some of you will take the opportunity to do that. You can explore them at coastal.climatecentral.org. All right, so here's a first look. We're going to go on a tour. This is Mumbai. In red, you see land that is less than the projected annual flood line in 2050. So that's sea level rise plus a kind of average worst of the year flood, as you can see, affecting a very extensive areas throughout and around Mumbai. And moving on, not every place is so threatened. Here's Chennai, very little threat, just out on the margins, when measured at this level, right, with these sea level projections and the annual flood level for mid-century. And here's Kolkata, a very severe threat, again at the same level. We can look at some other levels too. This is a tool that lets you explore a great deal of scenarios. So here are the current settings behind the map I've shown you, but I invite you to come in and play around. We don't have data on protective berms and levees that have been built, and that's an important thing to understand. That in Asia, these maps do not factor in coastal protections that exist today or might be built tomorrow, and we're explicit about that. And it's also important to note that these maps are based on the latest IPCC projections that just came out this summer. Here's a look at sea level rise just by itself as projected through 2050. So these are areas that are projected to be under the high tide line on just an average day. These are the areas projected to be under high tide line on an average day by the end of the century. And here's back to that look. We're going to continue the tour just looking at areas below the 1-year flood line, which is much more extensive. And you can see this little almost dry island of Kolkata. So there's a possibility that as much work as we've done to improve our data, it may not yet be doing the full appropriate correction for the most densely developed downtowns where you have um, the most buildings and density. There's something very profound to understand about sea level rise and climate change, which is that uh, ice takes time to melt. What you're looking at is a public art display that was put in place during the Paris climate meeting in 2015 called Ice Watch. And the most profound thing about it to me was the knowledge we all had that this ice would melt. I couldn't tell you exactly how quickly it would melt, how many days it would last, how many uh, liters per day or per hour might melt, but we knew it would melt. And the same is roughly true for sea level projections in the scientific community. It is a great struggle and enterprise to understand exactly how quickly sea levels will rise in the coming decades or this century, but we have more confidence in our long-term projections of how much ice will melt and how much water will expand based on the warming that we cause. And in fact, the more than 1 degree Celsius we've already warmed the planet, the ice sheets have not come close to catching up to that much warming. They're still melting because of that. And we can expect there to be around 2 meters of sea level rise from the carbon pollution that we've already put in the atmosphere, and a lot more from higher levels of warming that we could cause. So here's this new amazing resource that we have, Picturing Our Future, at picturing.climatecentral.org. We've got over 1,000 images and videos taken from more than 200 locations, more than 100 cities, and more than 40 countries, including many in Asia. And you'll see imagery like this. Here is the Lal Bagh Fort in Dhaka. And here is its future if we sharply cut carbon pollution to 1.5 degrees of global warming. And here's the scientifically projected sea level if we continue on our current path and see 3 degrees Celsius of global warming. And again, these scenarios that I've just shown you are the consequences that we can lock in today. They depend on the decisions we make at Glasgow. They depend on the actions that we take in the next decade, in the next several decades. They may then take several hundreds of years to play out, but we will have determined our legacy based on the decisions and actions we take today.
The major observation of this presentation, therefore, is that researchers are overestimating land elevations and are consequently underestimating flooding and sea level rise risks. Because the actual height of land areas is not entirely accurate in Asia or worldwide, this could lead to inaccurate predictions of the impacts of sea level rise and coastal flooding. I would like to turn now to our guests. First of all, Mr. Kamal Kishore of NDMA India, and may I ask you for your initial response to this data?
I think this is really of great concern to us, particularly for our coastal urban areas. And but it's also not just something which is going to happen in 2050. There are many things that will happen in the run up to 2050 when the sea levels would have risen, which is increased instances of urban flooding in coastal areas. In many parts of the coast, there will be instances of coastal erosion. Some parts there could be accretion as well. All of this is going to significantly alter the geography of the coastal areas. And the government of India, our states, are quite alive to this problem and working towards mitigating it by taking a number of steps. So for the first time, we have an effort guided by our Finance Commission to look at the problem of coastal erosion in the context of a changing climate, rising sea levels, and also providing special focus for urban flood risk mitigation in coastal cities. And that involves a number of things. One is, of course, looking at how do we manage land use now and in the future? How do we make sure that our drainage systems, the stormwater drainage systems, are ready not just for the rainfall of today, but also of the future? What is the kind of emergency response system you have in coastal cities? At the same time, look at how the upstream reservoirs, which are also a source of excess water in extreme rainfall events, are looked at in totality in the urban landscape in coastal areas. So work happening on many fronts, from looking at land use to improving stormwater drainage to looking at reservoir management, looking at the issues of coastal erosion. So I think this is really one of the big challenges of 21st century. Even if our mitigation efforts, climate mitigation efforts succeed, the prognosis is that we can experience increased incidence of disasters, both incremental as well as extreme events in coastal cities, and there needs to be concerted effort to address this.
Let me turn this discussion over to Mr. Marco Toscano-Rivalta. What is your reaction to the Climate Central data?
Well, actually, the reaction is twofold. It's scary for the potential consequences. At the same time, really encouraging because it helps us to do something about it. And I would say that you yourself, the ADPC, ABU, and certainly Dr. Strauss and the Climate Central are fundamental parts of the solution, because as also the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction adopted in 2015 says, awareness and understandings are a critical first step. So I would say that this analysis brings two fundamental points to our attention. The first one is that really countries need to do better to understand the climate and disaster risk they face. And this is the analysis that Dr. Strauss brings to our attention is a fundamental starting point, because then enables us to further integrate it with additional data and information, including at the local level, so to have a really comprehensive understanding of disaster risk in all its dimension. In other words, we need to complement this information on the hazards together with information on vulnerabilities, information on exposures, and also with the capacity that each local community or government may have. So this is really a critical piece from that perspective. Another important fact is that then governments can add on top of it the existing information that they have from other sources, and therefore having really a comprehensive understanding of risk in all its fundamental dimensions. The other important point that this analysis bring to our attention is that fundamentally, countries and governments really need to take seriously the warnings that are issued by the United Nations and others on the growing risk of climate change. And I'm really glad to see that Climate Central is using actually the latest IPCC projections, which, in the words of the UN Secretary General the Secretary General of the United Nations has called it a code red for humanity. And the other dimension of that is, as we can clearly see from the video, the sea level rise is something that has been set in motion and will really last for centuries, if not thousands of years, and is fundamentally posing an existential threat that basically bring echoing, making even worse the effect of storm surges and then constraining the limited arable soils. It also means that it's pushing more people to migrate, to leave their lands, their family land, and this is really heavy. And that's why I would also like to echo what the former Prime Minister of Kiribati said, that we really need to look for migration with dignity. There will be millions of people displaced by 2050, according to the World Bank, and then we will have millions of people in need of humanitarian aid on a yearly basis.
So, Mr. Kamal, the projected map of Mumbai, a city of 18.4 million people, shows several parts of the city submerged by 2050. Kolkata and Chennai are equally vulnerable to this threat. What approaches is India adopting to deal with these challenges?
See, the problem is not only about what happens in 2050, but also what happens between 2050 and now, when incrementally we'll see more instances of urban floods, more instances of difficult monsoon seasons, when there is extreme rainfall, when it combines with high tide, and combined again with rising sea levels, it will really make the situation very difficult when it comes to stormwater drainage. So a number of things that we're pursuing. Number one is a much greater effort on strengthening the coastal defense systems wherever we can. And then looking at improving stormwater drainage, upgrading standards for the stormwater drainage. We can no longer design our stormwaters for the kind of rainfall and the kind of sea levels we had in 19th century or 20th century. We really have to build it for the future. Improved land use management, incentivizing development in areas which are farther away from low-lying areas. So a combination of these approaches will help us begin to demonstrably reduce risk, not just in 2050, but also in the run-up to it. And the population, the people, the citizens of the cities that have this risk begin to see the benefits of investment in these systems in real time, so that the next year, the next monsoon, the monsoon in 5 years, when extreme rainfall events occur, you see less instances of flooding in coastal cities. I think moving people to safer places in an organized fashion and moving them back when the cyclone is gone is a short-term preparedness measure which is aimed at saving lives. And we've had spectacular success in that in the last 15 years. We've reduced mortality from cyclones by 95 to 98%. But we can no longer be satisfied by just saving lives. We have to go beyond saving lives to saving livelihoods. And that requires working on a whole array of things, not only evacuation, not just cyclone shelters, but also making sure that our infrastructure systems in the coastal areas are able to withstand extreme events that are occurring now, but that could occur in 10, 15, 20 years from now. For example, in Odisha, the example you gave of Cyclone Fani, we are working very closely with the power sector to see how we can improve the resilience of power sector to withstand winds, not just what we see now, but also what could happen in the future. How do we enhance the systemic resilience of power sector, both on short as well as long time scales, so that we minimize losses to power sector. When you minimize losses to power sector, the ripple effect go across the entire economy. When the power is there, then telecom works. When telecoms work, the ATM machines work. When ATM machines work, then the markets work. And when the markets work, then the livelihood systems work. So if we take a systemic view of risk and really begin to hardwire resilience in different infrastructure sectors, then we begin to move from saving lives to saving livelihoods.
So Marco, as you said, that governments actually need to work more on developing procedures. So what would be your suggestions for the country, that what kind of systems they need to put in place to mitigate or prevent this from happening and make data more comprehensive?
There are many things actually that can be done, I would say, at the global level, at the national level, at the local level. At the global level, certainly, we need to work really hard, I would say harder, to reduce emissions, to limit temperature rise at 1.5 degrees from pre-industrial levels. That's number one. Number two, it means also really providing the $100 billion per year to developing countries And we know that the needs are already there, and they may be quadruplicating by the end of the decade. A third very important thing is we need to really reach a balance between in the investment for climate action, in particular the balance between mitigation and adaptations. We really need to scale up the investment for adaptations, which at this moment is only 25% of the overall climate financing. And that's why the UN Secretary General is constantly calling for a 50% of the climate financing for disaster risk reduction and resilience. What we do know is that risk is local by nature, and therefore we really need, and governments, they really need to keep empowering local governments for action so they can really better understand the risk that they face and devise strategies and plans and be supported financially to implement those strategies. And in that sense, we are really glad to have the ADPC as part of our regional coordinating committee for these global initiatives that the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction has launched, which is called Making Cities Resilience 2030, which fundamentally aims at helping local government achieving this, understanding disaster risk, devising the plans and the policies, defining the investments, and then swing into action in partners with the local community.
I would like to thank all our guests today for their extremely informative contributions. As usual, if you have any comments or questions regarding the content of today's program, please get in touch with us via the ADPC's website, and we will attempt to reply as soon as possible. The next episode of Climate Talks in November will come from Glasgow and the much anticipated COP26. I hope you can join us then. Goodbye.